Okay, so let me just greet people, say hello. I'm delighted that Mike Movius invited me to give this presentation, and my thanks to you for attending. And as you can see from this cover slide, my name is Robert Levine, and I'm actually an English professor, not a history professor, at the University of Maryland. I am distinguished university professor there. I've been teaching there about 40 years, I hate to say. And I've been working on Frederick Douglass since the 1990s. So I'm particularly interested in Douglass, but among my other interests are Herman Melville, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. So as you'll see, I'm mainly going to talk about my most recent book, but I will say a few words about Douglass's last major speech, his 1894 anti-lynching speech called Lessons of the Hour. I was recently recruited to write an essay on that speech for an edited collection, so the speech is on my mind. The speech also has important connections to the topics I'll be addressing from my book. So just want to say about this opening slide that Andrew Johnson and Frederick Douglass dressed well. Johnson was a former tailor, and Frederick Douglass was really kind of self-conscious about how white people viewed in their imaginations Black people. So he liked to dress up and look civilized. And I'm going to talk more about Douglass and photography in a few minutes. So the title of this talk is Lessons of the Hour, Frederick Douglass, Andrew Johnson, and the Work of Reconstruction, but it's a talk mainly about my most recent book, The Failed Promise, Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass, and the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson. The book's title, The Failed Promise, gives you a sense of the large aims of a book that is mostly about the past, but also about the present. The very idea of a failed promise, after all, suggests that there is a promise still to be met. Hardly an isolated moment, Reconstruction has had consequences that we're continuing to live with as a nation. Like many historians, and again, I'm not really a historian, I think of Reconstruction as the period immediately after the Civil War when the Republican Congress and Black activists were hopeful that the former Confederate states could be made over into places where ex-Confederate officers worked in power and Black people had full rights as citizens. In some ways, these goals were achieved, but not without a fight against President Andrew Johnson, and much of the achievement was then undercut by the rise of Jim Crow segregation and the eventual lynching campaigns that were the focus of Douglass's 1894 speech, Lessons of the Hour. But to linger just a bit longer on the book's title, The Failed Promise also speaks to Andrew Johnson himself, who, as I'll be elaborating, initially seemed like he'd be a good Reconstruction president. But perhaps the key to the book's full title is the name Frederick Douglass. Typically, histories of Reconstruction and the Johnson impeachment focus on white radical Republican leaders like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, with Douglass and other Black figures in the background. In my book, I foreground the cultural work of Black activists, thereby providing for the first time a Black perspective on the early years of Reconstruction, on Andrew Johnson, and on the impeachment itself. For Frederick Douglass and other Black activists, Reconstruction was about Blacks' rights to citizenship, and he and his associates fought for those rights. Today, I want to tell you what I call the Douglass-Johnson story, 1865 to 1868. And I'll just say a few words about storytelling. This particular book is my first trade book. I've published a lot of academic books. Trade editors like stories. Stories, I think, are very useful in making arguments. And I had a lot of fun with this book, kind of trying to narrate a story, almost novelistically. So here's the story that I tell. On March 4th, 1865, Douglass and Johnson meet for the first time, kind of, at Lincoln's second inauguration. April 15th, 1865, Johnson becomes the 17th president of the United States following the assassination of Lincoln. September 29, 1865, we have Douglas's first explicitly anti-Johnson speech, wherein he refers to Johnson's imbecility and treachery. February 7th, 1866, it's a big moment in my book. It's when Douglas visits Johnson at the White House with a Black delegation to talk to him about Reconstruction. Summer of 1867, Andrew Johnson offers Douglas a job in his administration around the same time that Douglas is giving his most famous anti-Johnson speech, Sources of Danger to the Republic. And as you'll see, I think that he offers him the job to kind of shut him up. February 1868 to May 1868, we have the impeachment of Johnson. Douglas's son Charles attends the trial. The Senate falls one vote short of conviction. And Douglas does a little more writing about Johnson after the impeachment trial. So this is just an outline of the story that I tell in the book. Though Douglas did not participate in debates in Congress, he and many other Black activists spent 4 years engaging Johnson in a variety of ways. So I now want to turn to Douglas's and Johnson's first meeting as a way of setting up my story. That meeting, and I want to put that word meeting in quotes, occurred on March 4th, 1865, the day of Lincoln's second inauguration. This is a famous picture of Lincoln giving his "With Malice Toward None" speech on March 4th, 1865. And somewhere around here we have Lincoln. My historian friends tell me that somewhere around here we have Frederick Douglass. I'll believe them, but it's hard for me to see. Lincoln invited Douglas to the inauguration because they had become friends of sorts, having twice met in the White House during the Civil War to talk about such things as equal pay for Black soldiers. And these are very interesting conversations. But when Douglas tried to join the post-speech party in the White House, he was stopped by security guards who weren't expecting to see a Black man demanding admission to the White House. People who knew Douglas got him admitted, and as soon as Lincoln saw Douglas, he walked over to him, declared to those nearby that Douglas was his friend, and asked Douglas how he liked the speech. Douglas called the speech a sacred effort, and after Lincoln said how pleased he was, the president walked off to join Andrew Johnson, his vice president. Douglas writes about what happened next. This is from his 1881 Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which is actually the third version that Douglas published of his autobiography, the most famous of which is the 1845 narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. So this is what Douglas says about this particular moment. I was standing in the crowd when Mr. Lincoln touched Mr. Johnson and pointed me out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was the true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. Seeing that I observed him, he tried to assume a more friendly appearance, but it was too late. It is useless to close the door when all within has been seen. And as an English professor, I love the metaphor of the open door here. Back to Douglas. His first glance was the frown of the man. The second was the bland and sickly smile of the demagogue. I turned to Mrs. Dorsey, this is Douglas's Black friend, and said, whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he certainly is no friend of our race. So Douglas wrote this account 16 years after the event. It is retrospective, and I don't think it's to be fully believed because at the time, Johnson was actually regarded as progressive and even as a friend of Black people. The first U.S. president to face impeachment, Johnson was an up-from-the-bootstraps, self-educated person who worked as a tailor, dabbled in real estate, and then got involved in Tennessee politics, gaining one of the state's 2 Senate seats in 1857 as a Democrat, not a Republican like Lincoln. As it turned out, Johnson was the only Southern senator who opposed secession. Lincoln appointed Johnson military governor of Tennessee in 1862, and in 1863, Johnson, a Southern Democrat, called for the abolition of slavery. Johnson was nominated to be vice president in 1864 when Republicans feared they would lose the election with Hannibal Hamlin of Maine as vice president. They wanted sectional and even political balance and found Johnson to be an appealing figure for what they called their National Union Party. Johnson became even more appealing in Republican and abolitionist circles when, in October 1864, while still military governor of Tennessee, he gave a famous speech in which he declared to hundreds, if not thousands, of African Americans at the state capitol that slavery was abolished in Tennessee. Tennessee was an occupied state, so it wasn't covered by the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. Johnson's pronouncement in Nashville had no legal authority, but in some ways, the man who came to be regarded as incredibly racist while president did end slavery de facto in Tennessee, or at least in the Nashville area, by invoking his authority. Here's some snippets from a contemporary newspaper account of this particular speech. Near the outset of what came to be called Johnson's Moses of the Colored Men speech, Johnson announced the end of slavery in Tennessee and instructed blacks that they needed to find a leader to help them with their freedom. So he says to them, in due time, your leader will come forth, your Moses will be revealed to you. Now, according to the reporter on the scene, the large black crowd responded as follows: "You are our Moses." And the exclamation was caught up, says this reporter, and cheered until the Capitol rung again. "We want no Moses but you," again shouted the crowd. And it's kind of like a call and response thing. And Johnson's response is, "Well then, humble and unworthy as I am, if no other better shall be found, I will indeed be your Moses and lead you through the Red Sea of war and bondage to a fairer future of liberty and peace." So this speech made Johnson's reputation, at least temporarily. The newspaper article was reprinted in numerous other papers, including abolitionist newspapers. Johnson became obsessed with the speech, and over the next 6 years, whenever anyone accused him of racism, he would remind his critics that blacks of Tennessee themselves had called him their Moses. So at the reception for Lincoln's second inaugural, to circle back to that, Douglass said he saw a racist, but I'm not sure if that's what he saw in March 1865 or when he was writing up his autobiography in 1881, long after Johnson's terrible presidency. The fact is that when Johnson took office on April 15th, 1865, some thought that he would be more progressive than Lincoln. Meanwhile, the Frederick Douglass who attended Lincoln's second inauguration had all along been fighting for Black emancipation and Black civil rights. That fight goes back to the 1840s when Douglass became an abolitionist working for William Lloyd Garrison. Douglass believed that the Civil War should be regarded not just as a war to preserve the Union, but as a war of emancipation. And during the war, he formulated his vision of Reconstruction, which I call the Douglass argument. In speeches delivered during the Civil War and in remarks he made virtually every day of the Douglass administration, Douglass again and again said something to this effect: slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. Douglass said these exact words at the May 1865 meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society when, less than a month after Johnson became president, the white abolitionist leader William Lloyd Garrison called for the disbanding of the society because they had achieved their goal when the 13th Amendment had ended slavery in the United States. And that's what Garrison was all about, ending slavery. Douglass objected because blacks did not yet have the suffrage, and Garrison's call to disband the organization was put to a vote. Douglass's position won out, and Garrison subsequently resigned. The group stayed together until 1870, when the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. But let's keep the focus for now on the spring of 1865, in the first few months after the end of the Civil War. When Johnson on April 15, 1865, assumed the presidency after the assassination of Lincoln, many Republicans thought they had a president prepared to move forward on Reconstruction. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, one of the most radical of the radical Republicans, confided to friends after meeting with the new president that he was so convinced that Johnson shared his views on Black suffrage that he could comfortably say that, quote, the battle of his own life had ended, end quote. Other Republican leaders had similarly positive things to say about Johnson during the first few weeks of his presidency. But just 6 weeks after he took office, Johnson in late May issued an amnesty proclamation that essentially welcomed all the former Confederate states back into the Union on the condition that they accept the terms of the 13th Amendment. Otherwise, former Confederate officers could govern the states, and the ex-Confederate states could decide on their own what to do about the freed people, including denying them their civil rights. This shocked Sumner and his fellow Republicans, who thought that a man who claimed to be a Moses of Black people would be willing to entertain a more thoroughgoing Reconstruction, and Congress stood in his way. Here's two of the leading radical Republicans, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Both men championed Black suffrage and, as I say, initially believed Johnson shared their views. Breaking from Johnson after the amnesty proclamation, Stevens, during the summer of 1865, argued that the South had lost the war and therefore should be regarded as occupied territory, with the Northern victors deciding how to reconstruct the ex-Confederate states. President Johnson, by contrast, held firm to a bizarre belief that the Confederate States had never seceded because secession was not allowed by the Constitution, a position which historian Brenda Wineapple says is like claiming murder can't happen because it's against the law. But that's how Johnson viewed secession, as legally never having happened, and thus he championed presidential restoration as opposed to congressional reconstruction. And that is the big conflict between presidential restoration and congressional reconstruction between the president and Congress. Conflict between the president and the Republican Congress flared by December of 1865 and would culminate with the impeachment of Johnson in February 1868. Along the way, Johnson vetoed all legislation intended to help the freed people, though many of those vetoes were overridden by the Republicans as they moved forward with Reconstruction. The Republicans publicly turned against Johnson late 1865. Douglass and other African Americans turned against him more quickly. In a lecture in Boston in the fall of 1865, Douglass warned, quote, that the gains of the Civil War were on the verge of being lost because of the imbecility or the treachery of President Johnson. Douglass was also concerned that the Republicans weren't pushing hard enough for Black citizenship and that something needed to be done. That takes us to Douglass's second encounter with Andrew Johnson on February 7th, 1866. At a Black convention in Boston just a few months earlier, Douglass proposed that a Black delegation should go to Washington to lobby for the full rights of citizenship for African Americans. The convention approved the resolution, and the group, which included Douglass, arrived in Washington, D.C. late January of 1866. Johnson was willing to meet with the delegation because he thought it would be good publicity, and he brought along a stenographer named James Clephane, who had recently pioneered a new form of shorthand. Clephane's transcript of the meeting appeared in a Washington newspaper that very evening. It then went viral, as we say, appearing in newspapers across the country. The meeting did not go as well as Johnson had hoped. In fact, it embarrassed him. The nominal leader of the group was George T. Downing, a Black activist and caterer, and a friend of Charles Sumner, who had got him the job of running the congressional cafeteria. The secretary of the group was Lewis Henry Douglass, the Douglasses' eldest son. Downing began the meeting, and there's an amazing transcript of this meeting that appears in lots of newspapers. Downing began the meeting by telling Johnson that they were there to talk about Black suffrage. Johnson cut off any hope for an actual conversation by launching into a speech, which Douglass later said in his 1881 autobiography went on for hours, and he was exaggerating. Eventually, some in the group interrupted Johnson with questions, which made Johnson defensive. So he brought up his status as a Moses for Black people. And that's something that I found, that anytime he got defensive about civil rights, about his relationship with African Americans, he would remind people that he was the Moses of Black people, according to that 1864 speech. So this is from the newspaper transcript of the White House meeting between Johnson and the Black delegation. Johnson said, when he felt challenged, "I have said, and I will repeat here, that if the colored man in the United States could find no other Moses or any Moses that would be more able and efficient than myself, I would be his Moses to lead them from bondage to freedom." That comment seemed to end the discussion. Again, if you look at the transcript, this is a description of the Black people there going towards the door. There was an exchange of thank yous and goodbyes as the group headed out. But just as the Black delegation was about to go through the door, Douglass turned to the president and said, "If the president will allow me, I would like to say one or two words. You enfranchise your enemies and disenfranchise your friends." In other words, what Douglass was saying was that Johnson was helping the ex-Confederates, who were once his enemies, while scorning the Blacks, his friends who had fought in the Union Army. This accusation infuriated Johnson, and the meeting became a back and forth between Douglass and Johnson, all captured by the stenographer, in which Douglass goaded Johnson, getting him angrier and angrier so that Johnson would expose the full extent of his racism and his resistance to a Reconstruction that would empower African Americans. Eventually, Johnson declared that Black people should consider immigration. When Black activists read the transcript of the meeting, which was reprinted among other places in such Black newspapers as the Christian Recorder, they were outraged. This was a Moses for Black people? The meeting had gone away from Johnson. He expressed his frustration to his aides shortly after the delegation departed, and one of those aides shared Johnson's private comments with a newspaper editor who refused to print them because he supported Johnson and didn't want to embarrass the president. But the letter survives in manuscript. As reported in that letter, Johnson declared to his aides, quote, "Those damn sons of bitches thought they had me in a trap. I know that damn Douglass, he's just like any," and then he used the N-word, "and he would soon cut a white man's throat than not," end quote. Meanwhile, the Black delegation quickly crafted a response to what Johnson had to say to them at the meeting. The response appeared in the next day's Washington, D.C. newspaper as a frame to a corrected transcript of the meeting. Douglass and this group had media savvy. In his 1881 autobiography, Douglass described the meeting as a turning point for the way it exposed Johnson's racism and further undercut his support. That spring and summer of 1866 saw massacres of over 100 Blacks in Memphis and New Orleans, violence that Douglass and others, including many of the radical Republicans, believed was encouraged by Johnson's racism and his refusal to support Black suffrage. I particularly like this Thomas Nast 1867 painting of the New Orleans massacre of late July 1866, which led to the deaths of approximately 40 Black Americans. Here, Johnson, depicted as someone who regards himself as a king, and you see the crown, watches from a shed inscribed with a sentence from his Moses speech, "I am your Moses," and that's right around here. Right around the time of this massacre, Douglass remarked in a speech about Johnson that, quote, "The president who promised to be the Moses of the colored race has become their pharaoh instead. Speaking of 1867, this is a well-known photograph of Douglass made by Cincinnati's famous Black photographer, J.P. Ball. Douglass used this image as a visiting card. And one of the interesting things about Douglass is that he was obsessed with the new technology of photography, which he regarded as a democratic art and also as a technology that could help him represent himself to many, many people through these widely circulated photographs. He tended to wear nice clothes, to be dressed up, and to be in a way to be making a statement about how civilized Black people were, as opposed to the white stereotype of Blacks as ape-like people. If you're interested in Douglass in photography, here's another nice picture of Douglass. This is a recent book that was published by Norton in 2015. Their argument is, the argument of John Stouffer and his co-editors, is that Douglass was the most photographed man of the 19th century. And this book collects every known picture of Douglass, and it's now available in paperback. And I'm going to show you a couple more pictures down the road. But let's return to Douglass and Johnson. In December 1866 and January 1867, Douglass published anti-Johnson essays in the prestigious magazine, The Atlantic Monthly. Starting in December 1866 and through most of 1867, Douglass delivered various versions of a great anti-Johnson speech called Sources of Danger to the Republic. In the speech, which he delivered in Philadelphia and elsewhere, Douglass argued that the principal source of danger to the Republic was the Constitution's failure to offer proper checks on the presidency, which is a very interesting argument for our current moment. As elaborated in the speech, Douglass was troubled by the president's veto power, pardoning power, and access to patronage. All of this was very much to the chagrin of Andrew Johnson, who got regular reports about Douglass's speeches from his friends and advisors. So we're now in the summer of 1867, less than a year before the Republicans presented their articles of impeachment, and Johnson was beginning to feel desperate about trying to regain support from at least some of the Republicans. So what does he do? He offers Douglass a job in his administration as commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. Perhaps Johnson thought this would shut Douglass up, as I said earlier in this talk. Johnson made this offer through back channels because he didn't want to be publicly embarrassed if Douglass refused the job. Douglass thwarted Johnson by declining the job in a letter published September 1867 in a New York newspaper. The editor of that paper introduced Douglass's letter by saying, quote, the greatest Black man in the nation did not consent to become the tool of the meanest white. For this prudence and firmness, Mr. Douglass is entitled to the thanks of the country, end quote. So we now at long last come to the controversy that precipitated the February 1868 impeachment. By late 1867, Johnson wanted to fire Edward M. Stanton, who was the Secretary of War under Lincoln and then under Johnson. Johnson thought Stanton was overly sympathetic to the radical Republicans, but such a firing at the time would have been an illegal and even an impeachable offense under the Tenure of Office Act passed by the Republican Congress earlier in 1867. And here's a few snippets from the Tenure of Office Act, which was passed almost a year before the actual impeachment. And I can tell you that 2 decades later, the Supreme Court ruled this unconstitutional. I'm going to quote from 2 key sections of the Tenure of Office Act. From Section 1, every person holding any civil office to which he's been appointed by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall be entitled to hold such office until a successor shall have been in like manner appointed and duly qualified. Basically, Stanton had been appointed by the Senate. If the president wants to get rid of him, the Senate would have to go along with that. Section 6 stipulates that violations of the Tenure of Office Act would be regarded as, quote, high misdemeanors. In other words, as an impeachable offense. So why did Republicans pass such an act? I think they saw it as a pragmatic way of possibly getting rid of Johnson without exposing the Republicans to the charge that they were a Black party, something they feared would lose them votes from their white constituents who weren't terribly sympathetic to Black people. In February 18th, alternatively, you could go after Johnson for being a racist, but they didn't want to do that. In February 1868, Johnson asked Ulysses S. Grant, general of the U.S. Army, to fire Stanton. When Grant refused because of the Tenure of Office Act, and part of the Tenure of Office Act would have given a very hefty fine to Grant had he done this, Johnson went ahead and did the deed himself. So here's Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War from 1862 to 1868. And if you note here, he died in 1869. What I'm going to describe to you, I think, took a toll on this man. So he was fired, and the Republicans' response to the firing of Stanton was predictable. They were overjoyed, and they quickly formulated 11 articles of impeachment, all of which focused on the Tenure of Office Act. Stanton himself, and this is where I think things got hard for Stanton, Stanton himself refused to accept the firing and hid out in his office for several months to see what would happen. And my theory is that George T. Downing, the Black caterer who ran the congressional cafeteria, snuck him food. Meanwhile, Douglass and other Black activists had absolutely no interest in the Tenure of Office Act. They wanted Johnson impeached and convicted for his racist resistance to Reconstruction, which they believed had contributed to hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths of African Americans. They thought the trial itself should have been about something other than what one African American newspaper called, quote, legal quibbles, end quote. It's worth emphasizing that there were no Black voices as part of the trial. There were a few moments when the House managers of the impeachment talked about Johnson as someone who had done terrible harm to the freed people. But the trial was mainly about what Johnson had done to a white man named Edwin Stanton. Virtually all newspaper reports spoke to the tedium of the debates on whether the Tenure of Office Act had been violated. So this is a famous picture of the Senate as a court of impeachment, appeared in Harper's Weekly, April 11th, 1868. It was good theater, but it was boring. And if I could blow up this picture, you'd see that half the people up here are asleep. Frederick Douglass, wanted Johnson convicted and removed from office, but he remained on the sidelines during the trial. There are at least 3 reasons for Douglass's decision to keep his distance. First, he was frustrated that the trial wasn't focused on the big issues central to Reconstruction, such as Johnson's resistance to Black suffrage. Second, he didn't want his status as a celebrity Black man to distract from the proceedings. Third, he had his son Charles Ramon Douglas in Washington, D.C., and on occasion at the trial itself as a conduit. So Charles Ramon Douglas was Anna and Douglas's 3rd son, and he had a job at the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington, D.C. In letters that are now housed at the Library of Congress and that were a great resource for my book, Charles reported to his father on what was happening with the impeachment proceedings. Charles's position was clear. He had no interest in the Tenure of Office Act, and he wanted Johnson convicted as a failed Reconstruction president. But that didn't happen. There were votes on 2 of the 11 articles of impeachment in May 1868. Both fell short of conviction by 1 vote, and the Republicans decided to end the trial. Douglas, his son, and many other Blacks felt betrayed. Historians have speculated that the Republicans didn't want Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio to become president. And at the time, there was no vice president. And as president pro tempore of the US Senate, Wade was next in line, and Republicans lamented had socialist leanings. The Republicans instead wanted the popular Ulysses S. Grant as president, which could only happen through a general election. Grant did become president around 8 months later. Grant hated and fought the Ku Klux Klan, and yet during the 1870s, Reconstruction increasingly failed under his watch. From the point of view of Frederick Douglass, Douglass's two sons, George P. Downing, and other African Americans, the impeachment proceedings, with its focus on the Tenure of Office Act, had revealed the Republicans' reluctance to confront Johnson's racist resistance to Reconstruction head on. But Douglass did not publicly criticize the Republicans. Instead, he went after Salmon Chase, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who presided over the impeachment trial. According to Douglass and a number of Republican leaders, Chase did everything he could to keep the proceedings focused on the Tenure of Office Act instead of on Johnson's harmful actions toward Black Americans, which did come up occasionally during the proceedings, only to be shut down by Chase. And here's a picture of Chase, who perennially wanted to become president. And the interesting thing about Chase is that he was a former abolitionist and a friend of Douglass's, who was angling for the presidential nomination, not from the Republican Party because he couldn't get it at the time, but from the anti-Reconstruction Democratic Party, knowing that Grant would eventually get the Republican nomination. Douglass and his son Charles both thought that Chase favored Johnson, and they were furious that Chase, once a friend of Douglass's, had appeared to let his presidential ambitions override what had once been his moral convictions. And they both wrote about Chase. Charles, in a letter to his father, said that I'm not for any man who would help to secure the acquittal of Andrew Johnson. And here he's basically talking about the possibility of Chase one day becoming a presidential candidate. And Frederick Douglass, in an essay published 2 months after the acquittal of Johnson, was very critical. He said that Chase's courtship of the Democratic Party was, quote, certainly one of the saddest spectacles which could afflict the eyes of men. And he said that Chase's failed machinations led him to the gutter. As angry as Douglass was at Chase, however, one could argue that the Chief Justice was doing his job, given how the Republicans had framed the articles of impeachment around the Tenure of Office Act. So Johnson had been impeached, but not convicted. He served out his term to early 1869. Meanwhile, the radical Republicans had undercut Johnson's presidential power, and in 1868, the year of Johnson's acquittal, they oversaw the ratification of the 14th Amendment, granting birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law to African Americans. 2 years later, in 1870, Douglass celebrated what he regarded as the greatest triumph of all, the ratification of the 15th Amendment, giving Black men the same right to vote as white men, even as he continued to support women's right to vote. And you can detect Douglass's excitement about the 15th Amendment in this letter to friends in Rochester that was printed in an April 1870 issue of the New York Times. Douglass proclaimed, and as you can see in the slide, that the revolution wrought in our condition by the 15th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States is almost startling, even to me. I view it with something like amazement. It is truly vast and wonderful, and when we think through what labors, tears, treasures, and precious blood it has come, we may well contemplate it with solemn joy. Henceforth, we live in a new world. Had Reconstruction ended with the successful implementation of the Reconstruction Amendments, I would conclude my talk right here. But I have a few more minutes because this was not to be the case. True, slavery was ended by the 13th Amendment, but equal protection under the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment and Black male suffrage guaranteed by the 15th were increasingly threatened after 1870. Douglass took note of these developments in a number of speeches, culminating in the 1894 Lessons of the Hour. So I'm going to move quickly now from the 1870s to 1894. Johnson, who had come to be vilified in the late 1860s, returned to his home state of Tennessee in 1869. In 1875, he was appointed by the Tennessee state legislature as one of the state's 2 senators. And back then, senators were appointed and not popularly elected. But Johnson died just a few months into his term as senator. As this popular Courier and Ives print of Johnson on his deathbed suggests, Johnson was mourned by many as a former president. But Douglass remained angry at the former president for everything he represented, and he regularly linked Johnson to what he soon regarded as the failed promise of Reconstruction. In 1880, 5 years after Johnson's death and 12 years after the verdict that allowed Johnson to stay in office for another half year, Douglass had particularly harsh things to say about Johnson. And just real quick, here's Douglass from 2 negatives that are in the Library of Congress collection. So you can see what it looks like in 1880, and you see that bow tie, and he's well dressed. And one of my friends who studied these photographs says he only smiles in one of them. He's very serious. And this is what Douglass said about Johnson in 1880. Andrew Johnson, the Moses of the color race, and there's that Moses again, had betrayed that race into the blood-stained hands of the old master class. He had betrayed the Republican Party by which he had been elected when he was plotting the organization of a new party upon its ruins, when he was seeking the destruction of the Freedmen's Bureau, when outrage, riot, and murder held sway in the South. End quote. Johnson was no Moses. One could argue, perhaps incorrectly, that the Republicans' failure to make the case against Johnson in Douglass's terms contributed to the failure of Reconstruction because it allowed Americans to avoid confronting the racial issues at the center of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the nation's longer history. And Reconstruction did fail. By the late 1870s, the voting rights for African Americans secured by the 15th Amendment had effectively been nullified by anti-Black violence. It became extremely difficult in many places and nearly impossible for Blacks to vote in the Jim Crow South until the 1960s. From Frederick Douglass's perspective, the Supreme Court in 1883 contributed to the failure of Reconstruction by overturning the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which had attempted to shore up the 14th Amendment's granting of birthright citizenship to African Americans. So from Douglass's perspective, the Supreme Court had effectively made the 14th and 15th Amendments null and void. As he wrote in his 1892 expanded version of Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, the future historian will turn to the year 1883 to find the most flagrant example of this national deterioration. Here he will find the Supreme Court of the nation reversing the action of the government, defeating the manifest purpose of the Constitution, nullifying the 14th Amendment, and placing itself on the side of prejudice, proscription, and persecution. As Douglass pretty much predicted in his response to this ruling, the Southern states in particular would see an upsurge of anti-Black persecution, most horrifyingly in the form of lynching, which is to say the extra-legal killing of Blacks, mostly men, by guns, knives, flames, and hanging. Over 1,400 African Americans were lynched during the 1890s, and lynchings would continue well into the 20th century. During the 1880s and 1890s, the African-American journalist and activist Ida B. Wells, who was based in Memphis, emerged as the leading chronicler and critic of lynching, with her major work being Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, published in 1892. Douglass's anti-lynching speech, Lessons of the Hour, which is one of his greatest speeches, owes a good deal to the cultural work of Ida B. Wells. Douglass gave the speech in 1894, and I can't resist sharing this wonderful image, very posed image, of Douglass in 1894 at Cedar Hill, his Anacostia mansion overlooking Capitol Hill. We don't see his face. We see a man hard at work in old age, surrounded by his books. Maybe he's writing the speech right then and there. In the speech itself, which Douglass delivered to an enthusiastic audience at Washington's Metropolitan AME Church, Douglass challenged the running narrative that Black men were being lynched because they had sexually violated white women. Douglass said, if you want to know something about sexual violation, look at the history of the slave plantation, where white masters had regularly raped Black women, as his mixed race identity would attest. He argued that whites involved with lynching were projecting their guilt about that history onto Black men. Douglass gets to the nub of the matter in the two passages I put on the slide. As he makes clear, there is simply no way of putting a bright gloss on the current situation. Douglass bluntly states, quote, there is nothing in the history of savages to surpass the blood-chilling horrors and fiendish excesses perpetuated against the colored people, end quote. The use of the word savages is deliberate here, as this is the term that was regularly used to describe the Black men who were being lynched as alleged rapists. Douglass goes on to argue that lynchings were part of a continued strategy to deny Blacks the vote and in this way undo the 15th Amendment. As he remarks, quote, I have no confidence in the truthfulness of men who justify themselves in cheating the Negro out of his constitutional right to vote. But even in the 1894 Lessons of the Hour, in which everything he had fought for during the Johnson administration seemed to be in jeopardy, Douglass never gave up hope. And that is one of the many reasons I've loved working on Douglass over the past 30 years, his indomitable spirit of hope. Consider the way he concludes a speech that is mainly about horrific violence done to the Black body. These are the concluding sentences of the 1894 Lessons of the Hour. Put away your race prejudice, banish the idea that one class must rule over another, recognize the fact that the rights of the humblest citizen are as worthy of protection as those of the highest, and your problems will be solved, and whatever may be in store for it in the future, whether prosperity or adversity, whether it shall have foes without or foes within, whether there shall be peace or war, based upon the eternal principles of truth, justice, and humanity, and with no class having any cause of complaint or grievance, your republic will stand and flourish forever. Douglass may have lamented the failed promise of Reconstruction, but in the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents, he continued to see promise in the United States for the achievement someday of a multiracial democracy. He dreamed of your republic becoming our republic. His words and deeds continue to inspire. So I want to thank you for listening to me, and I'm just remind you of the main source of this talk is my most recent book, which was published by Norton. It's available from Norton in paperback for $16.95, which is a bargain. And bookshop.org, an interesting site that works with local independent bookstores and gets them the money as opposed to Amazon, though I have to say I do sometimes use Amazon. When I most recently checked, the book is available for $15.76. So thanks again for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions.